Good morning, everybody. To kind of wrap things up in terms of talking about interest groups and political parties, one of the last things we're going to look at connects to what I asked you to do yesterday. We're going to talk about voting. Yesterday, you were asked to look at like four different models that explain how people vote, how people make decisions, and then you kind of gave me your 2 cents on which one of those systems you feel like is the best to you use when you make decisions, any of those different things. So today we're going to talk a little bit more about voting as a process. First, we know that there's a varying level of awareness or interest in American politics. Uh, Different sources, different political scientists will tend to break the American public into three different categories. The first is the attentive public. That tends to be around a quarter of the American population. These tend to be folks who, constantly watch the news, are constantly engaged politically, right? Are following members of Congress on social media, that kind of stuff. These folks, again, follow that same kind of correlation that political scientists focus on, right? The idea that the more educated you are, the more likely you are to be politically engaged. The second um, category will be non voters. This tends to be around 35% of the American population. And these are seen as people who kind of are political do nothings, right? They just don't engage in the system because they think it's stupid, because they think it's unimportant. But this will also include people who will be non voters that will refuse to engage the system because they think it's broken, right? So non voters get, or political do nothings may not be 100% accurate, because you could have individuals who are activists, who are protesting, who are engaged in that way, but they refuse to utilize a ballot to endorse a system that they think is broken. The final is the part time citizens. These are the people who only get interested in political stuff in the leading up towards a presidential election, or if there happens to be something that shows up on a ballot that is of particular interest to them. This statistic at the bottom might be a little old. I don't know, if it's super accurate still to this day, but a large portion of Americans can't name, members of the government. That you can watch any of these kind of person on the street type interviews that a bunch of different shows will take on, right? And you'll find that people may not be able to name the vice president. They may not be able to name a senator, let alone their own senator, let alone both senators from their state. And it's because at times we feel disengaged from politics. Now, uh, the presidential election of 2008, when Barack Obama was elected to his first term, we saw a massive uptick in terms of individuals who would be considered members of the attentive public. The same thing is true in 2016 with the election of Donald Trump. That again, the attentive public numbers would have gone up because we saw a massive uptick in voter turnout in both the 2008 presidential election from previous years and then 2016 from previous cycles. Sorry, my medicine was staring me in the face and I didn't want to forget to take it. 2020 becomes one of these elections where voter turnout was huge. I don't know if where it ranks in terms of the top percentages of voter turnout in all elections in the United States, but this will be one of those things where, you know we will see if it is an anomaly or if it becomes the new norm. Right? That people, maybe felt more empowered or more inclined to vote when they had ballots, mailed to their home, versus being forced to take time off of work, going in and voting when you may not know what is going on in all of those elections and whatnot. In terms of influencing the government, we've spent the better part of the last 2 weeks looking at different ways that people can engage the government, right? The number one way that people can influence the government is voting, right? By changing the composition of who gets elected, of who is in power. That is your first way to impact things. But then we've also talked about how interest groups can have an impact in terms of lobbying the government, both from a group lobbying members of Congress sense to a grassroots movement kind of sense, right? Where writing letters, phone calls, tweets, petitions, all of those different things, uh, we can influence the government through reaching out, right? Using our right to free speech or press and petition uh, gets us there. In terms of participation, right, we tend to love to look at the spectrum of democracy on one end and a totalitarian or an authoritarian system on the other end. And in authoritarian systems, right, participation is very limited, that you are molded to endorse the system, endorse the party, endorse the leader, and that you show affect for the right, the power structure instead of asking questions or making demands on it. In the United States, however, right, we tend to see more engagement, and if people are on the losing side of something, that may cause more of like a rally around the flag effect. Now, in some instances, we may see cases where people want to fight the outcome of an election instead of accepting the results, right? The Civil War is an example of where this happens. People will point at President Trump in 2020, or some of his Republican allies in Congress refusing to acknowledge Biden's win. But that's not the same kind of magnitude, right? Unless we saw some kind of insurgence, or Trump refusing to leave the White House, then that's a different kind of level. And then there are different kinds of routine forms of participation in the government, right? We've talked about how things like the national anthem or the Pledge of Allegiance are some of those tacit level citizen molding things that uphold the idea that the system is something that is good and ought to be respected. It's a tradition that is meaningful and we should engage, right? That is one belief set that is still influencing the government because you are pledging allegiance to the flag, right? And acknowledging that hopefully the government does the best things to defend the nation. But even things like jury duty become ways to influence the government because you are accepting one of the responsibilities that you get in terms of being like labeled a participating member of society. Paying your taxes is something that can be rolled into this as well. Right now, you get penalized for not paying your taxes, but that's a different conversation for a different day. However, we're still kind of politically weird in the United States, and these numbers have changed a little bit, especially in 2020, where we were seeing more like this is a battle for the soul of America, that you either uh, vote for President Donald Trump to keep America great, or you vote for Joe Biden to right the ship from all of the wrongs that have happened these last 4 years. But for the most part, statistically, less than 1 in 4 people try and influence the vote of another person. And it's because this tends to be more intimate and secretive. Uh, there's a joke that Dave Chappelle has on one of his early stand-up specials about like two guys in the workplace talking about like having sex with their significant others, and then someone shows up and goes, "Hey, who'd you vote for?" And the guy's like, "No, that's personal, that's private," and then goes back into talking about something that he's doing in the privacy of his own bedroom. And we still have that kind of attitude at times towards politics, right? Asking me who I voted for is offensive as asking someone their weight or their age. In terms of other statistics, only about 1 in 20, and this number has gone down, or sorry, the number of people who do this have gone up as digital contributions have gotten far easier. But a lower number of the population are willing to make large contributions to a candidate, and then only 1 in 6 people will designate taxes to the presidential fund. That there's a box you can check when you fill out your taxes that it's something like a $3 or $6 donation to the presidential fund, which is something that attempts to fund political parties equitably. So when we talk about a barrier that minor political parties have, they have to hit like a 10 to 15% of the national vote threshold to be eligible to get money from that presidential fund to help increase the strength of their campaigns. So it tends to be private because we're not actively seeking to persuade people to vote or change their vote, or we're not willing to, vote with our pocketbook. But again, these have been rapidly changing in the last 8 to 10 years, in particular after a Citizens United kind of decision. Voter registration is a very, very interesting subject to look at or talk about. Because there are a lot of people that say, right, you need to register to vote because you need to, be a stakeholder in the democracy. We're afraid of voter fraud. We're afraid of felons, non-citizens, all of these, different groups that are labeled as unable to vote. We don't want them to vote. Uh, some studies show that registration discourages voting for several different reasons. Um, Part of it can be seen as an inconvenience to register. Part of it is seen as like people don't want to like document their political preferences. Like if you register as a member of a party, which you kind of do that anyway when you vote. Um, but some people will say that the act of registration is something that discourages voting. In terms of voter registration, it varies by state. Some states have very strict voter ID laws. If you try to register to vote for the first time here in Kansas, you will be forced to functionally fill the form out, and then print it out as a PDF and send in like a copy of your birth certificate, your social security number, something that identifies you as a citizen who is the age of 18. Um, there are some states where you can just bloop, 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 fill out a form online, and boom, you are registered to vote. The most important thing to know is what the cutoff date is to stop registration before an election. Now, like you could still register after this window closes. It just means you're not eligible to vote in that election. But you need to know what date the cutoff is in your state, and again, it changes from state to state in any given year. But the most important thing to know is that no state can stop voter registration from happening more than 30 days before any kind of election. One of the things that happened to make it, in theory, easier to get people to register to vote was the Motor Voter Act. This was a law that was passed in the late 80s or early 90s that essentially allowed people to register to vote when applying for a driver's license or renewing their license. Some states make it easier to register to vote because you can go to a school, a library, a city office, a county office, like any form of government entity, and you can go to have your voter registration processed there. The Motor Voter Act allowed states to permit mail registration, which is one of the norms today. And then where it becomes inconsistent on bullet number 4 is whoops, uh, the idea of whether or not you can register as a member of a political party. This is something that's not consistent in every state. Some states do not have an option for you to register as a member of a party or not. Uh, it just you register to vote. In other states, you register and declare your allegiance to a party. That is important for two reasons. Number one, it may give those parties access to some of those funds that we talked about earlier. But second, for your ability to participate, it impacts whether or not you can participate in some primaries, right? For example, the state of Kansas is a closed primary state, which means when we are having our primaries for congressional offices, for president, for anything else, where we have to whittle down multiple candidates from one party to one candidate per party. A closed primary or a closed caucus means you have to be a registered member of that political party to be able to participate in that election. So if Kansas didn't have a Democratic primary, but they had a Republican one, I could not vote in the Republican primary unless I was registered as a Republican, and vice versa. In terms of talking about turnout in general, turnout is always the highest in presidential election years, that we see those as the elections that have the highest stakes, right? We believe that the presidency is the most important thing in the world. Uh, but in terms of primary elections, off-year elections, or the midterms, when we're 2 years into a president's term and the House and a third of Senate is still up for re-election, we tend to see that turnout is still lower in those kinds of elections than um, the presidential elections, or general elections tend to have higher turnout than primaries, and it's because we tend to see those as having higher stakes than any other election. That's the same thing. Uh, State and local elections tend to have lower turnout. This is especially true if their elections are not happening in the same cycle as the federal office elections. So, like, I know here in Lawrence, we will have years where some offices will be on the ballot in terms of things like county, city or county commission, the school board, that kind of stuff. It may coincide with the general election for federal offices, but there are also some years where, like, we'll have to go vote in like March for some of those offices, and people are like, nope, not a big enough of a deal. In Those are old. I don't want to talk about that, and hopefully I remember to get rid of that. In terms of who votes, again, these are correlations that political scientists have found over time. And again, 2016 and 2020 are a little bit too recent of elections to see if there are significant uh, like divergences from the trend lines of the past, to see if we can debunk some of these. But education level, as education increases, the likelihood of voting increases over time. In terms of race, ethnicity, or sex gender, white folks tend to vote more than non-whites. And this is something that we've seen change a little bit. Like, there are a lot of people who are like, black women got Joe Biden elected in all of these states. Uh, but statistically speaking, white folks are more likely to vote, and women are more likely to vote than men. In terms of income, this is the other correlation that we've talked about several times before. The wealthier you are, the more likely you are to vote. The higher status career you have, the more likely you are to vote. And then there's an age correlation as well. The older you are, the more likely you are to vote as well. And these are the big trends that, when political scientists make these sweeping claims about, like, here's why this person needs to win X vote, it's because they're looking at past data points to determine, what parts of the electorate are key to getting somebody, into office. Think if you watched CNN while we were waiting for this presidential election to be cleared, and you saw John King kind of zooming into every like county and every little thing on his map, he could sit there and push buttons to tell you what kind of individuals voted which way in 2016. And that's where he was like, well, Trump needs this level of support from this group to be able to win this county or this state, or Biden needs to perform better than Clinton did with this group, blah, 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 blah. that these are studied data points, but these data points also matter because that's what they, not just the media, but campaign strategists look at in terms of how to whip some support up or turn some support out for their candidate. Uh, in terms of the impact of non-voting, people treat it as this serious, egregious crime. But there are several different schools of thought on this, right? Some people say if you're not informed, you shouldn't vote. If you're too lazy to vote, you shouldn't vote because you might not understand the repercussions of that outcome. But then that's also kind of problematic if you're just discounting the opinion of folks who you deem lazy in a democracy. Second, there's a very good argument that maybe there is some class bias in the way that our elections are set up, right? That trying to take off work during some part of a day on Tuesday could be problematic, that it might be difficult to find childcare or, right, be able to walk away, like if you're working at a Wendy's, right, be able to get some time off that you need to go vote because you might need that income to support your family. So there are some folks that make an argument that non-voting is not necessarily a choice that people want to make. It's something that they have to make because they're worried about other obligations. Now, some of this could change in a world where, we see more mail-in or early voting, that if those opportunities increase, that might change the nature of some of these. But it could, if is a true class bias or a race bias in some of this, then it leads to groups being not represented in the government, which means, our democracy may fail to represent the best interests of everybody. There's also the notion that if you're not going to go out and vote, then you are tacitly showing your approval for the status quo, right? Like, I don't need to go vote for or against this person because I think the system is doing okay now. Um, right? So, low motivation may show acceptance of the system. So, that could be accurate or not accurate in your case. Um, if there were elections where there was serious low voter turnout, it could shift the balance of power at times, right? So it could be a false level of acceptance of the system, and then, right, it changes. Uh, and then people have cited the need for electoral reform, right? After the 2000 presidential election, we started seeing a wave of things. And if you're not familiar with the 2000 presidential election, we'll talk about the Supreme Court case Bush versus Gore in the next unit. But essentially, what happened in that election was you had the state of Florida in a recount system, and they were using an old method of paper voting where you would stick your ballot in, this apparatus, and then you would push little knobs to, like, poke holes in a piece of paper to show who you were voting for. And when they had to go through and recount the presidential election, there were ballots thrown out because they couldn't necessarily determine on the second count who a vote was cast for, if the paper wasn't fully perforated, if the paper wasn't, uh, like, if there was a bump in it but not a full hole. There was a big controversy over hanging chads, which, if you poked a hole in the piece of paper and it wasn't a clean poke, that there was, like, something still hanging on for its dear life, that was seen as not a legitimate vote. So then we led to an increase of electronic forms of voting, uh, but that has become problematic in today's world because we are still using the same machines in many instances that we picked up after the 2000 presidential election. I don't know about you, but I don't know if there's a single piece of technology in my home that is maybe more than 6 years old, like maybe my MacBook, maybe some of my older gaming consoles that I play occasionally, But like we know that technology continues to get better by the day. The processing power, the security, all of those different things have radically changed. And in a world where we may be afraid of like people trying to attack the American elections through some kind of cyber threat or cybercrime, this becomes another era where, you know, we need to make sure that we have machines that are safe, fair, and will uh, definitely count what's going on. I'll definitely say that this statement at the bottom is something that people tend to be worried about, that the media will project a winner or call that somebody has won a state before the polls closed. But I think in the 2020 presidential election, they did a good job of kind of not wanting to declare a winner and move on, that they were more than willing to wait and make sure that everything was in order before they did so. I've already talked about those things already. In terms of why people don't vote, it can be things like, physical or mental illness, unexpected travel at the time, different levels of citizenship status may or may not make you eligible to vote. Some of it can be, things like, it's inconvenient, right? I can't get off of work. I can't go to this place. I might not have transportation to my polling place to vote. Uh, some of it is they don't believe their vote will make a difference. Statistically speaking, your vote doesn't matter. I'll show you an equation on Monday where it's like, here's the percentage chance that you have of your vote mattering. Uh, so they believe it won't make a difference, and we'll talk about the symbolic power of voting later. Or a big one is they distrust the process. They don't like the candidates, right? So it's not necessarily like I don't want to do it. It's legitimate reasons like illness or impairments, or it's lack of easy access to vote, a belief that your vote doesn't matter, or a lack of trust in the system. That are all reasons that are very legitimate as to why people may not participate. And we'll stop here because this is what you read and broke down in class on Wednesday. I'll post these slides up on Classroom. There's a little bit of stuff about the Voting Rights Act at the end of this set of notes, but we will talk about the Voting Rights Act when we get to discussions of civil rights, civil liberties at the end of the semester. And that's that. So hopefully this helped give you some very exciting insight into the wild and wacky world of voting. Let me know if you have any questions, and we'll talk more in the next class. Thanks, y'all.